ambulance rocked slightly as it sped down the empty main street of the small town, its sirens cutting through the otherwise quiet evening. Ava sat in the passenger seat, fiddling with the clasp on her latex gloves while glancing over the details on her tablet. Male, mid-30s, collapsed in the food court at Eastside Plaza. No history of heart issues, no meds in the system, according to witnesses. She read aloud. Bystanders mentioned bite marks? She frowned, turning to her partner. Bites? In a shopping mall? What's that about? Connor grunted as he steered the ambulance around a corner. Could be anything. Maybe someone's dog got loose and went to town. Or, I don't know, the guy's into weird stuff. Ava shot him a look, but something about the call didn't sit right. Bite marks weren't exactly common in their line of work, especially not in a situation like this. They pulled into the parking lot of the Eastside Plaza. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across the pavement. A small crowd had gathered outside the food court, their faces pale and tense, as though afraid to get too close to what was happening. Some pointed toward the ambulance as it rolled to a stop. Ava and Connor stepped out, grabbing their gear, a response bag, a gurney, and the portable AED, just in case. Ava adjusted her gloves and gave Connor a curt nod. Let's keep this simple. Assess, stabilize, and transport. Inside, the food court was chaos. Tables were overturned. Trays and drinks spilled across the tile floor. The air smelled of fryer grease and something metallic. Blood. The patient lay sprawled on his back near a kiosk, his shirt damp with sweat. His pale skin gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. "Sir, can you hear me?" Ava called out, kneeling beside him. She pressed her fingers to his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, erratic. His skin was ice cold. Connor knelt opposite her, unzipping the response bag and pulling out a blood pressure cuff. Bites, he muttered, gesturing toward the man's arms. Angry red marks dotted his forearms, jagged and clustered like a series of small, deep pinpricks. The spacing was uneven, almost random, and some wounds looked older, beginning to scab over, while others were fresher and oozing blood. Rat bites, Ava murmured, leaning closer. Definitely rat bites, but why would he? Not the time, Connor cut in, strapping the cuff around the man's arm. What's his pressure? Ava ignored the question for a moment, focusing instead on the bites. The edges were swollen and blackened, with a sickly yellowish hue spreading out from the center. Tiny threads of pus oozed from the punctures, leaving glistening trails on his pale skin. She pulled back sharply, the nausea rising in her throat. God, that's nasty. 60/40, Connor said, his voice tense. Barely there. He's crashing. Ava grabbed her stethoscope and leaned over to listen to the man's chest. His breathing was shallow, rasping like air forced through a clogged pipe. His lips parted slightly, and for a moment, Ava thought he might be waking up. His eyelids fluttered, revealing bloodshot eyes with pinpoint pupils. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just a faint, wet gurgle. Hey, stay with us, Ava said sharply, tightening the oxygen mask over his face. Connor frowned as he checked the man's wrist for a pulse. It's weak. We need to move him. They worked quickly, maneuvering the man onto the gurney. He was disturbingly limp, his limbs flopping unnaturally as they lifted him. The bystanders watched in silence, their wide eyes fixed on the paramedics' every move. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, Ava's radio crackled. Unit 12, status? She raised it to her lips. Unit 12 en route to County General with an unresponsive male. Severe trauma, possible infection. Patient is unstable. The man's body spasmed violently, nearly toppling off the gurney. Ava jumped back as Connor scrambled to hold him in place. His mouth gaped open, jaw dislocating with a wet crack, and a guttural growl escaped his throat. "Shit! What the hell is that?" Connor yelled. Before Ava could respond, the man's arm shot up, biting at Connor's wrist. His teeth dug deep, drawing blood as his hands reached toward Connor with unnatural speed. Ava reacted instinctively, grabbing the AED and slamming it into the man's temple. The impact sent a dull crack through the air, and the patient collapsed back onto the gurney, motionless. "Get him in the rig. Now," Ava said, her heart pounding. Together, they shoved the gurney into the ambulance and slammed the doors shut. Connor leaned against the wall, cradling his injured wrist, blood dripping through his fingers. "You okay?" Ava asked, fumbling for gauze. Connor nodded weakly, his face pale. What the hell was that? He flatlined, right? He was dead. Ava didn't answer. She wrapped Connor's wrist in silence, her mind racing. The man had been dead. She was sure of it. The sirens wailed as Ava floored the accelerator, heading for the hospital. They had barely made it out of the parking lot when a low, guttural growl rose from the back of the rig. Ava's eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. The patient sat bolt upright, his head snapping toward Connor like a predator locking onto prey. "Connor!" Ava screamed, but it was too late. The man lunged, teeth bared. The ambulance veered off course, crashing into a parked car with a bone-jarring thud. Ava's head slammed into the steering wheel, stars bursting in her vision. When she looked up, the back doors were swinging open. The patient was gone. Connor groaned, slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath his wrist. Beyond the open doors, the parking lot stretched out into the dark. Ava could hear a wet, dragging sound, slow, deliberate. "Connor," she whispered, crawling toward him. He stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering. Something was out there, waiting. And Ava knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The air outside the ambulance was unnervingly still. Ava stood with her back pressed against the side of the vehicle, gripping a flashlight in one hand and a pair of trauma shears in the other. From somewhere in the shadows came the faint sound of dragging footsteps, accompanied by an occasional wet snarl. Connor sat slumped against the front wheel of the ambulance, his face pale as he cradled his injured wrist. The gauze Ava had hastily wrapped around it was already soaked through, the fresh blood staining the fabric. "Hey," Ava whispered, crouching beside him. "You with me?" Connor gave a shaky nod. "Barely. What the hell is going on, Ava? That guy, he was dead. I mean, dead. What are we dealing with here?" "I don't know," Ava admitted, her voice low. "But we need to move. We can't stay here." From the direction of the shopping center came a faint scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Ava flinched, gripping the shears tighter. Connor's eyes flicked toward the sound. "You think this is happening everywhere? Or is it just him?" "Does it matter?" Ava hissed, scanning the parking lot. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then she saw them. Two figures stumbled out of the shopping center, their movements uneven and jerky. At first, Ava thought they were injured civilians. But as they moved closer, she noticed their faces. Their eyes were blank, unfocused, and their jaws hung slack. One had ragged, deep gashes across its chest, the kind no one should be able to walk away from. Shit, Ava muttered, grabbing Connor's arm. We've got company. Get up. Connor groaned as she helped him to his feet. Are they like him? Ava didn't answer. The figures were moving faster now, their stumbling steps turning into an unnatural, uneven sprint. They were still far enough away, but that wouldn't last. We're heading to the convenience store, Ava said, nodding toward a brightly lit storefront across the lot. Move. Now. Connor staggered alongside her, clutching his wrist as they half jogged, half stumbled toward the store. Behind them, the sound of their pursuers grew louder, feet scraping against pavement, low groans that grew into guttural snarls. Ava reached the door first, slamming her shoulder against it. It didn't budge. Locked, she hissed, yanking at the handle. Connor pointed weakly toward a shattered window near the side of the building. There. Ava didn't hesitate. She grabbed Connor by the arm, pulling him toward the window. Shards of glass stuck out like jagged teeth, but she didn't care. She shoved him through first, then climbed in after, her legs trembling as she dropped to the floor inside. The store was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigeration units in the back. Shelves lined with chips and candy bars stood undisturbed, a surreal contrast to the chaos outside. Ava helped Connor sit against one of the shelves, then peeked out through the window. The two figures had reached the ambulance, circling it with slow, deliberate movements, their heads tilted unnaturally, almost as if sniffing the air. They're looking for us, Ava whispered, ducking back inside. I don't think they're just wandering, they're hunting. Connor swallowed hard, his face pale. What the hell are we supposed to do? We've got no weapons, no way to call for help. We'll figure it out, Ava interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She knelt beside Connor and unwrapped the gauze from his wrist. The bite was deep and fresh, the crescent-shaped marks unmistakably human. Blood oozed slowly from the punctures, the surrounding skin already inflamed and red. This looks different, Ava muttered, her brow furrowing. Different how? Connor asked, his voice shaky. Ava glanced back at the memory of Patient Zero's wounds, the small, precise punctures, jagged and irregular, like rat bites. Connor's wound was far messier, a single brutal bite from a human. I don't think it's the same as his, she said, more to herself than Connor. His looked like rats. Yours, it's human. Connor's eyes widened, panic creeping into his voice. What does that mean? Am I going to... Don't, Ava snapped, cutting him off. We don't know anything yet. For now, we keep moving. A sudden crash from the back of the store made them both jump. Ava's head whipped toward the sound, her heart pounding. Another groan echoed, closer now, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. How did they get in? Connor hissed, struggling to pull himself upright. Ava didn't answer. She grabbed a metal broomstick that had fallen near the shelves, gripping it tightly as she crept toward the noise. Her flashlight flickered over the aisles, casting long, eerie shadows. The footsteps grew louder. Ava tightened her grip on the broomstick, her palms slick with sweat. Then she saw her, a woman with torn, blood-stained clothes, staggering between the shelves. Her neck was bent at an impossible angle, and her jaw hung loose, dripping blood and saliva. Her blank, lifeless eyes locked onto Ava, and for a moment, she froze. The woman lunged. Ava swung the broomstick, the metal pole connecting with the woman's face in a sickening crunch. The force of the blow sent her stumbling back, but she didn't fall. Blood poured from her shattered nose as she turned back toward Ava with a guttural snarl. Ava swung again and again, her arms shaking with every impact. Finally, the woman collapsed, her body twitching slightly before going still. Ava stood there, panting, her chest heaving as she stared down at the corpse. The air was thick with the stench of blood and rot. From the front of the store, a loud bang echoed as something slammed against the locked door. Then another and another. "They know we're in here," Connor muttered, his voice shaking. "We've got to go, Ava. Now!" Ava nodded, grabbing Connor and helping him to his feet. "We head for the main road. The station's not far. If we can make it there." "Big if," Connor muttered, but he didn't argue. The banging grew louder as they climbed out the back window, the cool night air hitting them like a slap. The street was eerily quiet, but the distant sound of sirens hinted at chaos spreading elsewhere. Ava tightened her grip on Connor's arm, her eyes scanning the darkened streets. The infected weren't swarming yet, but they were out there, waiting, and the night was far from over. The road stretched out before them, dimly lit by sporadic streetlights and the faint glow of the moon. Ava gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she guided the car through the eerily silent streets. Connor sat slumped in the passenger seat, his head leaning against the window. His breathing was shallow, labored, and his skin had taken on a sickly gray pallor. "Stay with me, Connor," Ava said, glancing at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. "We're almost there." Connor groaned softly but didn't respond. Ava felt the dread clawing at her chest. The bite on his wrist. It had looked bad from the start, but now the veins around the wound were darkening, spidering out under his skin like black tendrils. Ahead, the streets were empty, devoid of the chaos they'd left behind at the shopping center and convenience store. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound a potential threat. Ava gritted her teeth, focusing on the faint glow of the police station's lights far off in the distance. Just a little further. "We can make it." Connor stirred, letting out a low groan. His head rolled toward her, and for a moment, Ava thought he was trying to speak. His lips parted, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a guttural, wet rasp that sent a chill down her spine. "Connor?" Ava whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. His eyes opened, glassy and unfocused, and his chest heaved with labored breaths. The black veins were spreading up his arm now, creeping toward his neck. Ava's grip on the wheel tightened as panic surged through her. "Don't do this. Don't you dare leave me now," she muttered, her voice breaking. "You're stronger than this." Connor's body jerked violently, his back arching against the seat. Ava slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. Her heart pounded as she turned toward him, her flashlight in hand. "Connor!" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. His head snapped toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. But they weren't Connor's eyes anymore. They were pale, cloudy, and empty. His lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing blood-stained teeth as he lunged toward her. Ava screamed, throwing herself against the driver's side door. Connor's seatbelt held him back, but his strength was unnatural, his movements jerky and aggressive. His hands clawed at her, his nails scraping against her uniform. "Connor, stop!" Ava sobbed, tears streaming down her face. She fumbled for the door handle and shoved it open, tumbling out onto the pavement. Connor thrashed against the seatbelt, his guttural growls filling the night. Ava scrambled to her feet, backing away from the car. Her chest heaved as she struggled to process what was happening. The man who had been her partner, her friend, was gone, replaced by something monstrous. She didn't have time to think. The growls and snarls drew attention. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, their movements slow but deliberate. The infected were closing in. "No, no, no," Ava whispered, glancing between the car and the approaching horde. Connor's growls grew more frantic as he tore at the seatbelt, his nails digging into the fabric. Ava turned and ran, her footsteps echoing on the empty road. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself to keep moving. The faint glow of the police station lights flickered in the distance, a fragile beacon of hope. The crackle of static from the car's radio caught her attention. Ava hesitated, turning briefly to see the horde swarming the vehicle. Above their snarls, a panicked voice broke through the static. Firefighters requesting backup at Bayleaf Apartments. Multiple injuries reported. Fire spreading rapidly. Repeat, fire at Bayleaf Apartments. We need assistance. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. Ava turned away, her chest heaving with a mix of fear and helplessness. The sounds of the horde faded into the distance as she pressed on, her mind racing. The station wasn't far now, just a few more blocks, but deep down she knew the truth. There was no safety, no sanctuary. The world she knew was gone. As she stumbled forward, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, Ava resolved one thing. She would survive, for Connor, for herself. The faint glow of the station flickered ahead, but the darkness around her felt endless. The night was far from over.